Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. Today I'm going to be talking about psychological rigidity, extremism, and violence, and the potential relationship between these three variables. So, to begin, I'm just going to discuss the variables and some of the confusion that might arise when thinking about these variables. So, starting off with psychological rigidity. What is it? Well, in basic terms, it can mean the tendency to get stuck in a particular mindset. I think it's easy to intuit what that might mean. So, quite single-minded. If you know anybody that's quite single-minded, maybe a more technical way to describe that would be they're quite psychologically rigid. In more technical neuropsychological terms, what the phrase psychological rigidity means is it refers to the difficulty in switching between different modes of thinking, or the difficulty in adapting to a changing environment, which can present important difficulties present important implications for kind of obvious reasons. Now, when you're reading about the phenomenon of psychological rigidity, you'll find that different authors refer to the phenomenon in different ways. So some people use mental or cognitive in place of psychological, or they say inflexibility instead of rigidity. For the purposes of clarity, I'm just going to refer to psychological rigidity. All those different phrases refer to the same phenomenon. So now on to extremism. Well, we might be more familiar with extremism referred to as radicalism. And again, they're the same thing, but I'm going to mainly refer to extremism. So, what is extremism? It's defined in different ways and it's conceptualized in different ways, which can be problematic. So some people see extremism in terms of the direction of a person's ideas. So using the example of politics, imagine someone who's extremely left-leaning and imagine someone who's extremely right-leaning. Someone who's extremely left-leaning might have very liberal ideas, and someone who's extremely right-leaning might have extremely conservative ideas. But I tend to consider extremism as something that disregards the direction of a person's ideology. So it doesn't matter where on the political spectrum you are, it just matters how committed you are to your position. So if, let's say, you're a little bit left-leaning, so you're kind of liberal, but you feel like being just a little liberal is extremely important and you would do anything to remain that way, and you would do anything to enforce those type of ideas on other people. To me, that's very radical. That's very extreme. Now, the direction is just a little bit left, but the commitment to the ideology is very, very extreme. So I like to conceptualize extremism in that way. And I want to provide an important example as to why I think that way. So in 1934, there was a centrist group, a politically centrist group in France called the Jeunesse Patriote. My French pronunciation is probably not excellent, but I make an effort. So the Jeunesse Patriote rioted on the streets of Paris, causing the deaths of 5 people and injuring 1,319 more. Their ideas were centrist, but their commitment to those ideas were very, very, very strong. So the direction of their political leanings actually wasn't the important variable in that case. It was the extreme commitment to the particular idea that was important. Now, we don't necessarily think of centrist politicians or people with centrist ideas as being extremists, but let's say you aren't committed to very, very liberal policies or very, very conservative policies, but you're very committed to something in between. It's been found that after extremist or terrorist events, which are typically perpetrated by people on the extreme left or the extreme right, it's found that after these events, that votes for centrist parties go up. So with this in mind, we have to be careful as to what extremism means, because there could perhaps be a centrist conspiracy in the future which masquerades a terrorist attack as either right or left leaning, but wasn't perpetrated by either side, by either direction. It was perhaps perpetrated by a centrist party because they predicted, look, research has shown that if an event like this occurs, we're going to get more votes. So I think we should be on the lookout for extremism across all ideologies. So there's psychological rigidity and extremism. What about violence? So violence is typically conceptualized in a physical act which is going to inflict pain or damage to somebody else. Now, sometimes we use violence in a different context, such as violent language, the violent speech, violent ideas. So the type of violence I'll be talking about is the more loose definition of violence would be in terms of violent language and ideas. So what is the link between psychological rigidity, extremism and violence? There does seem to be a link there, but it's yet to be really properly discerned in the research. So the relationship between these three variables of psychological rigidity, violence and extremism has yet to be properly described, but there has been some pioneering research by Lior Zmigrod and colleagues. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She's a fantastic researcher out of the UK, very young lady who's doing incredibly important work in trying to develop a better understanding of what's going on with these three variables. And what she has found is that people who are psychologically rigid appear to be more committed to commit violence in service of their nation or to protect their own group against an outside force. They're more likely to commit violence against other people, and they're more likely to risk their own lives for an ideology, which has important implications. Now, a lot of Lior's research is new and it has some room for improvement in the future, and she's continually doing lots and lots more research on the topic of psychological rigidity and its links to all different types of variables. But initial results are very promising. Now, further research will probably give us a greater predictive value of psychological rigidity in terms of understanding how is it linked to violence, how is it linked to extremism. And this future research could look at extremism across all different groups, like I kind of described earlier, as opposed to exclusively looking at the direction of an idea, but primarily to the commitment to a particular idea. And this type of commitment can manifest itself in very, very different groups, be it a political group, be it a football club with football hooligans, be it in racist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan or other xenophobic groups. And because the research is somewhat in its infancy at the moment, there will be improved methodology. So some of Lior's research from 2019, it looked at citizens in the UK and the US and it asked them how likely they were to commit violence against themselves or other people to protect their nation. Now, the UK and the US has a very large immigrant population, so it's very possible that a lot of the participants in their study didn't really identify with British nationalism or US nationalism. Perhaps they identified much more as Irish or as Pakistani or as Spanish or as Mexican. It's hard to know. So I think a good adjustment for research of this kind in the future is to ask a participant, what nation do you have most affinity for? And then ask them how likely it is that you are to commit violence against somebody else to protect the ideas of that nation, or how likely are you to risk your own life to protect that nation, as opposed to just thinking, okay, this person is from the US, we're going to ask them how they feel about protecting the US. Or this person's from the UK, we're going to ask how likely they are to protect the UK by committing violence. Another area of future research, which I think could be very promising, is looking at the neural correlates of psychological rigidity and of extremism and likelihood to commit violence, because there has been research on each domain separately, but there's yet to be a really integrated comparative analysis. And I think such a comparative analysis would inform a much greater understanding of, well, what's going on in the brain for these different phenomena. Is there an overlap? It appears there is, but I think there's more that researchers can do there. And another area of future research would be to look less at self-report of psychological rigidity and more at behavioural measures. And lastly, a longitudinal study would help us much better understand if a person is psychologically rigid in childhood, well, does that predict extremism in later life? These are all questions that remain to be answered. But I think it's incredibly important research that Smigrod and her colleagues do. And I'd highly recommend you check her and her research teams out and some of the things she's been working on, because it's fascinating and incredibly important. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe already to see more videos like this, and ring that bell to make sure you see any upcoming videos that I'm releasing in the coming weeks. And if you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up, and if you disliked it, hit the thumbs down, and let me know in the comments as well what you did like and what you didn't like, and share this with a friend that you think that might be interested. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.